Hello there, and welcome to the Super Subs. This is actually a bonus episode of the Super Subs. This is your co-host, Harry, speaking. We are actually going to be doing a separate Q&A session for the U.S. men's national team, specifically with our special guest, Tim Rollinson. So this is actually a continuation of our last episode that we just released yesterday. So if you're listening to this and it's November 25th, Friday, we just released a preview podcast on the World Cup yesterday on Thanksgiving, November 24th. The reason that we're making this episode is because the first time that we had Tim on the podcast, we had a few technical difficulties during the recording. My audio wasn't recorded, but Tim's audio was recorded, and he had some amazing answers to the questions that myself and Andrew asked him, so we didn't want any of his answers to go to waste. So here is Tim with a few questions and answers to our questions. I believe we have 5 or 6 questions and answers that we'll go over in this bonus episode of the Super Subs. So sit back, enjoy, and hope you learn a little bit more about the U.S. men's national team Q&A in this episode. So the first question we actually posed to Tim was, what is the direction of U.S. soccer, and can he describe a little bit about this men's national team to our listeners? And Tim very eloquently describes a few different phases of the U.S. men's national team, where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going for the future. And he just tells the listener reasons of why we should not be worried, but we should be actually encouraged as a nation in the direction that we're going as a football or soccer nation. So here's Tim's answer on the direction of the U.S. men's national team.
No, thanks. That's a great question, and I'm gonna take a big zoom out. So when I think about, kind of like the journey to get to this team, I think it's been like a very, very long road. So I think it really begins for the U.S. There was I think a 40-year period where they didn't even qualify for the World Cup, and basically had amateurs representing the national team. And that went all the way up until 1990, and that was right after they had just been announced as the host for the 94 World Cup. So in 4 years, World Cup's going to be on U.S. soil. It's going to be a game changer. It's going to be the sport of the future. And that group of amateurs qualified for the first time in 1990, didn't make much noise at that World Cup. And then I think right after 94, that's when the MLS became a professional league. So Major League Soccer is the pro league in the U.S., and that debuted, I think, in 96, if I'm not mistaken, so a couple years after the World Cup in the U.S. And I think that was one shift in eras, was from kind of the amateur team to this MLS era. And I think the pipeline for a lot of men's national team then became college to MLS, and then the top players, so you think of your Landon Donovans, Clint Dempsey's, would go over to Europe. But it was a very, very select few, and I think it was because the MLS was seen as kind of a inferior league, kind of weird, plays a different schedule than leagues in Europe. Not much to talk about if you're looking at soccer on a global stage. And then I think we're really transitioning into kind of a third era that I think is really, really exciting. And I would say this team is kind of the bridge of the two eras. So there's still, I would say, maybe half the squad that kind of came from that previous pipeline of college soccer to the MLS. So if you think about like Tim Ream, Jordan Morris, Walker Zimmerman, those are guys who played college soccer and were kind of top cream of the crop, and have kind of made their mark as pros. But then there's this new generation who are growing up, and instead of going to college, they're at MLS academies and going pro when they're teenagers, which is really similar to how things are done in Europe, where you become a professional, when you're 16, 17, 18, and start getting pro minutes, playing with fully grown men, full professionals. And I think with this team, you're seeing these 22, 23-year-olds who have already been pros for 4 or 5 years. So if you think about Weston McKennie, Tyler Adams, Brendan Aronson, these are guys who grew up in the U.S. They didn't go to college. They took this pro route. through MLS academies and are now, really making a name for themselves in Europe. I think the biggest concern with this team is their youth and inexperience. So if you look at those past teams, those guys were nailed on starters for their clubs. Now maybe these were MLS clubs, not as strong as teams in Europe, or maybe lower level clubs in Europe, maybe in Belgium, maybe in the Netherlands, something like that. But they were getting minutes and they were really important players. And I think with a lot of the players on the team now, even Pulisic, who I think is probably the biggest talent, he's kind of a spot starter at Chelsea, so not really consistently playing every single minute, which isn't uncommon for a 22, 23-year-old. But our whole team is kind of made up of that. So I think what we're going to see is those players grow into their primes. Hopefully put on a big showing at this World Cup and then kind of continue to grow that way. But then just the pipeline that's going to be feeding through. Now there's 30 MLS academies. You look at in the early 2000s, there was one residency academy. So it was basically, 20 kids or something like that who are in this pipeline. Now it's thousands of kids who are in that pipeline to become pros. So I think this is a time to be really excited about U.S. soccer. When you talk about the team itself, I think, Harry, you nailed it. I think the midfield is probably the most dynamic part of the team. So the nickname that a lot of people have given the starting midfield is MMA, which is Musa McKennie Adams. But it kind of sounds like mixed martial arts, and it's good because and it works because they kind of cage match people, I think is the vibe that you get. And I actually am not scared about that midfield up against anyone. I think even if you look at a team like England, Tyler Adams, basically he replaced this player Kelvin Phillips at Leeds, who then went to Manchester City for, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars, and the team doesn't look worse for it. And this is a 23-year-old kid. He's the captain of the team, of the U.S. team, and he's just absolutely having the season of his life for Leeds right now. And I think it's incredible that these young guys are really kind of making noise over in Europe. So yeah, I think a lot to be excited about. If we look at the England matchup, so I hear what you're saying, Harry. I think there is definitely the experience discrepancy that I talked about. I think a lot of those England players are really crucial players for their team, but I think what this U.S. team can look at that I think will give them the confidence is if you look at, for example, Jude Bellingham, right? I would say he was maybe the strongest player on England in their win against Iran. So he plays for Dortmund. He's been playing incredible this season. Him and the U.S. is one of their best players, Gio Reyna, who Andrew, I know you mentioned. They play together. They've grown in that academy together. And in watching a ton of Dortmund games, I would say if you looked at it 1 or 2 seasons ago before Reyna had some injury issues, the talent was comparable and maybe Gio was even relied upon more. So I think he probably looks at that matchup and says, I'm not scared of Jude Bellingham. Like I play against him in training every day. You look at Pulisic versus Mason Mount. They're both on Chelsea together. Pulisic's starting over Mason Mount some days. They're close friends, but they're also competitors and teammates together. I don't think he looks at that and says, I'm scared of playing against Mason Mount. So yes, I think there's definitely, a step still to go. But I think American soccer, if you look at it, is definitely heading in the right direction. And that's not just the national team, but I think the MLS is really growing in quality and I think shifting to buy a lot more players from like young players, not only from the US, but from South America, from European countries. And I think we're going to start to see the quality just improve as we go. But yeah, I think this World Cup itself is a very, very exciting one. I think the team, like we talked about, put on a decent showing against Wales, but I think they still have a lot left in the tank. And I think we're going to be hopefully really happy with the results we see in the next couple games.
So that was question 1 from Tim. Question 2 is a question that a lot of U.S. football or U.S. soccer fans are going to be wondering about, is now that we understand where we are as a nation in terms of talent for U.S. soccer, how do we get to the next step? Is it an infrastructure problem? Is it that we don't have enough talent homegrown? Do we have to grow the MLS? How do we actually get to the point where we're competing against the top 5, top 10 leagues in terms of talent, in terms of consistency, in terms of the FIFA World Rankings? Our U.S. men's national team can compete on the world stage. We obviously know that with the World Cup, but how do we get to that next step where we're actually seen and respected as a league, whether it's the MLS or just the talent coming from the U.S.? And Tim gives a great answer on this question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think there's probably a lot of different pieces to that. But I think the most crucial part to it is raising the level of the domestic league and then investing in young talent. So if you look at countries like Argentina, like Brazil, most of their top players are playing in Europe, but people are still crazy about their domestic leagues, and their domestic leagues are pretty much where every young player begins. So I think giving those young players an opportunity at a professional level is super crucial. And usually on World Cup international rosters, those teams will still have the top players from their domestic leagues. So I think it's really, really important that the MLS continues to raise that level. And I think it's going in that direction. And I think a key piece to that is becoming a development league, not only for folks from the US, but from Latin America, I think Central America, the Caribbean, and then South America. So for players from Ecuador, Paraguay, even Brazil and Argentina, giving them that opportunity to make a good wage in the U.S., have that good infrastructure, and then give them that hope that they can get sold to Europe. I think a great example of that in the English Premier League right now, somebody who's really tearing it up is Miguel Almiron. So he was actually from Paraguay, bought and played in Atlanta for a couple years, was absolutely incredible in the MLS, and then got bought by Newcastle. So I think that's an example of a player that shows that. I think another one that's more of a homegrown talent is Alphonso Davies, the Bayern Munich star. He's from Canada, grew up there, and came through the Vancouver Whitecaps Academy, and then went to Bayern Munich. A lot of people thought he would be a project, but pretty much made an immediate impact. So, I think that's a huge piece. And then I think that the second piece is those clubs, the MLS clubs, investing in youth players and giving them playing time. So I think the two examples of clubs that have done a really good job and where it's paid off is the Philadelphia Union and then FC Dallas. So Philadelphia Union, if you look at Brendan Aronson, Mark McKenzie. Brendan Aronson's brother actually just got bought by Frankfurt the other day.
Yeah, Pax.
And so Paxton, exactly. So Philly has kind of created that pipeline, and they're being paid well for it, right? They're getting millions of dollars in transfer fees that they can then reinvest in their academy and continue to do well in the domestic league. And then FC Dallas is where so many top players have come through. So Weston McKennie, Chris Richards, Brian Reynolds, Ricardo Pepi. These are all guys who are now playing in Europe who came through the FC Dallas Academy. So I think the teams continuing to invest in that is going to be really, really key. And I think those use or those case studies I think will kind of create a great example that more teams will start to emulate, and we'll see that pipeline just grow and grow. And the hope is that this generation of young talent isn't a golden generation, isn't a one-time thing, but is actually like a trend that continues on, right? Like with a team like Brazil, people would almost never say it's a golden generation because every generation in Brazil is a golden generation, right? Like they always have talent coming through the pipeline, whether it's Ronaldinho or Neymar now. It's like just constantly they have these superstars coming through. So I think that would be the goal, is that it's not one Pulisic, it's not one Tyler Adams, it's just a whole string of those players who are kind of making it in the US and then going to Europe to take that next step.
That was question 2 for Tim. Question 3 is a question that maybe not a lot of US football or soccer fans are wondering too much about. Maybe you're not even as familiar with the manager or the coach of the U.S. men's national team, Gregg Berhalter. But Andrew posed a question to Tim, asking Tim his thoughts and opinions on what kind of job, whether good or bad so far, what kind of job is the coach of the U.S. men's national team doing so far? And here are Tim's thoughts on the current coach of the U.S. men's national team.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I wouldn't say that I feel super strongly in any certain direction on this. I would say he's a manager where I think he has really defined strengths and then some weaknesses that are pretty easy to spot as well. So on the strength side of things, I think what I like about him is that he's very encouraging. He creates a really good environment for the players, and they seem to really love being a part of the international setup, which I think is super crucial, right? Because these guys are on their basically taking time off from their job that's paying them to go represent their country, and if that's a chore, that's gonna show up in their play. But I think all the U.S. players, if you look, they love going to camp. They love seeing their friends. They're coming from the same generation, and I think he's really created a really good core in that way. And I think done a really good job of getting a few key dual nationals is what they call those folks that could represent multiple different countries. Getting some of those players to come to the U.S. I think at the end of the day, the players that he's picked to be his kind of core are the right players. So if you look at the starting lineup against Wales yesterday, I think it's pretty spot on in terms of the best players that have showed up for the U.S. in the past and have the top talent. I think where I think his weaknesses are is a couple things. Number one, his in-game adjustments I think can be super tough. So the Wales game is an example. At halftime, they brought on a striker named Kiefer Moore, and they really switched up the way that they played. The U.S. didn't make any adjustments at halftime, or even if it wasn't at halftime, after they saw that Wales was changing the way that they were playing, they were being much more direct, playing it to Kiefer Moore, who was 6'5", playing it to his head and letting him win those aerial duels. I think that's when, as a coach, you need to look at that, assess, and say, okay, how are we going to then change our tactics to then match that? Because we're seeing that switch things up. So I think his substitutions yesterday fell flat for sure. Yeah. And so I think that's one case, but I think that's happened in other cases as well. But for the most part, I think international soccer or international football is a tough game, and I think you look at any country, there's usually criticism of the national team manager just because they don't have that many chances. So I would say I'm relatively neutral, but I would love to see him be a little quicker with his subs. I think in the game against Wales, a lot of the players were super tired, and it showed in the play in the second half. And then number two, I think being a little bit more tactically flexible or responsive, I think would be what I'd say. And give the team a chance to win, even when maybe the game script flips a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was question 3. Question 4 is a question directly from Andrew, and I will let him take this away, and it is about the U.S. men's national team goalkeeper.
So I think the U.S. men made Gregg Berhalter, the coach, made a good decision in picking Matt Turner as his starting goalkeeper. For those that don't know, Matt Turner is an amazing young talent in the form of his life. He's currently the backup keeper at Arsenal, which is an English team, and has been performing really well. A lot of clean sheets in the Europa League, especially. But the big kind of, I don't know if controversy is the right word. I don't think it is. But, the omission of Zach Steffen, who was our previous number 1. And for those that don't know, he was the backup goalkeeper for Manchester City in England for a long time. He decided to leave and go to the league below, the championship, to play on loan at a team called Middlesbrough, in hopes of getting enough playing time to make a case to be part of the squad. ended up being left out. Was curious to get your take about our goalkeeper situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to agree with you 100%. I think Matt Turner is the guy. I think it was the right choice. Matt Turner, I think, is an example of just maybe the most classic like American soccer player. So I would say the trend right now in Europe is these like sweeper keepers is what people call them, which means that they can play with the ball at their feet. They can drop passes in certain areas that wouldn't be expected of goalies. Matt Turner is not that at all. So he's kind of awkward looking in his movement, and especially when he's on the ball. But he's probably one of the best shot stoppers I've ever seen play. Full stop. I think his shot stopping ability is incredible. He had one big save against Wales and didn't really get tested other than that. But there was a graphic that came out the other day that showed since 2018, the last World Cup, the most expected goals added, and we're getting really into deep stats here, but basically, or expected goals against is from the shots taken at a goalie, how many goals would the statistics say should go in, and then the expected goals against would be how many basically the goalie saved of that. And Matt Turner was actually the number one of all the World Cup goalkeepers. Now that's a very kind of specific stat, but I think it shows that he's great at positioning. He's great at getting his body set for the shots, and really springing and those reaction saves. So yeah, I think it was the right choice. Zach Steffen, I think he's definitely a talent, but I think a couple years of not playing really hurt him. And I think really what it boils down to with him is his decision making. There's a lot of games where he'll come out of his box, make kind of silly errors. And I think goalkeeper is just not a position that you can make errors in, because one error can mean the difference in a game. A forward or a striker loses the ball, that's okay. They get it again, right? But if a goalie lets one in that they shouldn't, that's kind of a no-no. So I think it was the right choice. I mean, I think there's definitely still some development in that goalie position. I think it would be great to see Matt Turner starting somewhere, and I think, like you said, he's been putting in good performances. So hopefully that earns him a chance either at Arsenal or somewhere else. But yeah, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think it's the right choice, and I'm very confident with him in net.
That was question 4. And question 5 is a question that I posed to Tim on if he could actually improve any position on the current U.S. men's national team squad that is at the World Cup, what position would he choose? And here's Tim's answer.
Ooh, gosh. So, all right, I'm gonna take my emotions from the Wales game out of this, because that's making me want to say center back. But if there was a bad penalty given away by one of the center backs, Walker Zimmerman, and I think he's getting a lot of heat for that. But if you looked at his performances basically through World Cup qualifying, basically anytime he's put on the U.S. shirt, and in MLS as well, he rarely makes mistakes like that. In fact, the guy who was praised the most for his performance was probably Tim Ream, who was the other center back, and he's, I would say, much more mistake prone, even though he plays at a higher level. So I still feel confident with those guys back there, even though that was a bad one. I think I would have to say the striker position is probably where the U.S. I think is lacking the most right now. I think it's rare to find a striker who's consistently scoring week in and week out and consistently does it over seasons. And so I think the U.S. has some really interesting talents. So Josh Sargent, who started the game, Jesus Ferreira, who's on the bench, Ricardo Pepi, who didn't make the squad. These are all guys that I think have a ton of potential and I think could be really amazing strikers at some point. But at this point, I just don't think they're fully formed. So if you look at the rest of the team, I think they have at least one elite level skill. I don't think any of those strikers are elite at anything yet. And I think they'll get there. They're all young. I think they're all 20, 22, 23. But I think that's probably where we could use the most help. And when you look at a team like England and you see someone like Harry Kane who can just he passes well, he finishes, his movement's incredible, he can score in a lot of different ways. The envy comes through. Like there's a lot of positions on the U.S. team where I would love to pit our guys up against any team. Maybe they don't win every time, but I feel good about it. But I think the striker position's one where there's a lot of work to be done.
That was question 5 for Tim. And the last question we had for Tim is one that a lot of U.S. football or soccer fans might be interested in, with the fact that the U.S. is a fairly large nation and we're quite good at a number of sports, whether that's basketball, the NFL, baseball, etc. But for football or soccer specifically, we've never quite been a powerhouse on the world stage in the top 5 or 10. But things are changing nowadays. There were players that were touted to be young talents like Freddie Adu many, many years ago, but we're seeing a lot more young talents today on the world stage in Europe or in other leagues. And the question to Tim is, why is that the case today versus years past? And Tim gives his answer on that.
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I mean, I think really with any youth like international youth contingent, right? Like if you take a look at, like, let's just say the 15-year-olds in any given country, there's going to be those top talents that are already identified at that age. But what you'll see is that oftentimes those folks don't work out. Like those particular players, when they get to the professional level, a lot of them can't crack it. And the difference is, you're playing against people your age until you get to the professional level, and then you're playing against people who have been paid to do this for a decade or more, right? Like that is a big shift from, playing youth soccer to playing professional soccer. And I think the biggest thing is just having numbers and having the amount of players to actually have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 that hit and become those world-class players. So when we had Freddie Adu, who was, I would say, one of the top youth talents, not just from the US, but globally at the time, I think when he was 13, 14, 15 years old, that's one guy. And so it's just basically riding on his shoulders. And I think that's a lot of pressure on one person. There's a kid now, and his older brother, I think, is in kind of the U20 setup, so in the 20-year-old age range for the US, but he's, I think, 13, 14, 15 years old, and he's already being scouted by Real Madrid, Barcelona, all these top teams, and they're saying, like, okay, this kid could be like a world-class player one day. He's playing like way above his age level, but you'll never hear about him in the US media, and that's because, there's Christian Pulisic, Gio Reyna, there's players that are already playing at those top clubs, so it's not a headline, right? Like, it's not as exciting to have a kid getting scouted by Real Madrid when you have Serginho Dest playing at Barcelona. So I think there's a couple things that have just kind of shifted, taking the pressure off those individuals, and then shifting it, I think, more towards the whole contingent. And I think that's a really, really good sea change, and hopefully we start to see that develop.
So that was a bonus episode of the Super Subs, a Q&A about the men's national team from Tim. A big thanks to Tim for coming on the podcast, for going through 2 long takes with Andrew and myself, and for having a smile the whole way through, and for enjoying every bit of it. I know Andrew and myself, we enjoyed talking to Tim, and we're hoping to have him on the podcast again. Tune in next time for our next topic. I believe we will talk about the basic rules and regulations of football and what you need to know as a newer fan or a fan that wants to get refreshed on the game. For now, we're subbing out. See you all on the next one.